If you've ever played Banjo-Kazooie, you'll quickly realise that one of the main objectives in the game is to collect a whole bunch of notes. Now the reason we're collecting these notes is to get past the various note doors in the lair. This one, for example, you need at least 50 notes to pass, and just worth mentioning, it doesn't actually take away 50 notes when you pass it, you just need that many to get through. We've also got the 180 note door, 260, 350, 450, 640, 765, and the legendary 810 door. Now it's also worth mentioning there are some other note doors in the game near the end. For example, these note doors here next to Dingpot, which house the egg, red feather and gold feather refills along with the extra honeycombs. If you open these up you do get those refills, but realistically if you want you can literally just peck through the door and get the refills anyway. But it turns out that these aren't actually needed to beat the game, because if you master the grunty fight you can beat it pretty easily on 5 health and not many eggs or feathers. And so that leaves our total at 810 notes needed to beat Banjo-Kazooie. Thanks so much for watching. Just kidding, of course we're going to break this. I presume the reason why they made it 810 was so that you had to go into all 9 levels at least once and you couldn't skip G's by skipping Click Clock Wood. But of course we're going to break this using our speedrunning techniques and glitches to get past some of these note doors. Let's check it out. I'll start by talking about the easier note door skips and gradually move on to some of the really hard and TAS Only skips. It also turns out this is a really interesting question because it actually depends what version of the game you're playing on as to how many notes you need to beat it. We'll start off with 640 note door skip, and that's going to involve a velocity clip into the water. So just around the corner from the 640 note door is this water level switch here, and that raises up the water a bit higher. What we want to do next is ledge clip off this bit by building up a lot of downward speed and falling through. And since the water's raised, we can just swim right around to the back of the 640 note door like so, and jump straight through behind it. And that means we can skip the 640 note door in pretty much all versions of the game fairly easily. So next up we got 350 note door skip. What you have to do is spawn this fly pad in the Frazizi Peak lobby and then take the running shoes across to it. If you can get flying in Banjo-Kazooie, you can usually find a spot to clip out. And this one is pretty heavily used in speedruns, or at least a variation on this to skip 450 note door. Basically what you do is you fly over here and go to this little corner. You can then beak bomb out of this corner to get out of bounds. All you need to do once you're out of bounds is just navigate up towards the 350 or 450 note door. Beak bombs usually help you get there. And there we go. Now we can skip 350 note door, again, on all versions of the game. So as I said, we can use the same clip to skip the 450 note door, and this one's seen a bit more commonly in runs. All you have to do is beak bomb to the 450 note door from out of bounds and get to it from behind without actually hitting the note door itself. And there we go, now we can skip the 450 note door too in all versions. So next up we have the 765 note door skip, and this involves transforming into the bee from Click Clock Wood. So it depends what version you're playing on, but in every version you can skip this note door. First up, if you're playing the NTSC version, what you can do is actually clip out on the note door itself. So pretty much what you do is you sit under there, do a particular sequence of button presses, and you get out of bounds. In this footage I'm just flying back towards the lair, but you can easily fly behind that note door and skip it. It's actually worth noting that this clip doesn't work on the current emulator used for TASing Banjo-Kazooie, so it's caused quite a few issues in the past because of that. Now if you're playing on the PAL version, which was released in Europe and Australia, it's a pretty similar process. You just clip out in a different spot. You sort of go up to this top corner and get out of bounds. From there, if you'd like to, you can fly behind the 765 note door to skip it. There's also one other method which involves using the sprint tilde to clip out of bounds. Basically what you do is you get hooked on the roof, you fall through, and then if you get sprint tilde to push you into the wall like that, you fall out of bounds. From here you could skip the 765 note door, and the good thing about this method is that it works on all N64 versions and the Xbox version of the game. There's also another really obscure way to skip the 765 note door, and this happened by accident to a runner called King KC. This is the footage of their run. So essentially what happens is if you die while holding a jiggy and then go and grab this one with the bee, there's a chance that you either despawn an object or crash the game. That object could be the 765 note door, and then you skip it. If you come back into the room, the door actually comes back. I'll leave a link to a video explaining this jiggy despawn glitch in full detail. So I will cross off that we can skip the 765 note door, but I am going to do it in red because I'm not thrilled that we need all this extra setup involving going into Click Lockwood and getting the B. But there is one more way to skip the 765 note door, and that's related to this tiny little gap in the ground here. Hopefully you can see there's that little black line in the ground, and Banjo can actually fall through this. In fact, if you've seen my any % TAS of Banjo-Kazooie, you'll know this is exactly how the 765 door is skipped there. We jump up here, and then we very precisely line up with that ground position, jump into it, flutter out of bounds, and ground pound up through the door. You'll notice I paused there, and that was to get a lag frame to help with clipping through the ground. If there's a timer on screen and you pause, that does produce a lag frame. And conveniently, we did have a timer on screen in the TAS because we just raised the water level for that 640 skip I talked about before. Now it turns out this 765 skip worked because there was a tiny gap in the ground here, but it turns out that pretty much all ground in the game has tiny gaps in it. This is a technique called a bit clip, and I'll leave a video explaining it in detail, but as a general statement, if you look at the ground, it's made up of triangles, and if you look at any of these edges, each edge has about a 1 in 3 chance of being filled with teeny tiny gaps that Banjo can fall through. Unfortunately, this is ridiculously precise and pretty much TAS only to do in practice, especially if you want to fall through the ground, flutter under the door, and then ground pound back up through it. That's going to be a TAS only trick. Now, speaking of bit clips, this is going to be our tool to break the rest of the note doors. Here's the 810 note door, which is the biggest, most important one to skip. We create a lag frame with eggs, get into the bit clip spot, and flutter underneath the door and ground pound through. There we go, we just got 810 note door skip, and that brings the total needed down to 260. Now I've crossed off the 810 note door in red because it's really important to note this is TAS only, so the limit for human runners will still be 810 notes to beat the game, unfortunately. It would be great if we could find an RTA setup for 810 skip. I know people have tried and gotten quite close, but it's still not there quite yet. Now, if you're not keen on bit clips, there is also this alternate method to do 810 skip, but this also wouldn't be very useful RTA because in my opinion it would actually be harder than the bit clip setup. Sweeping back through the layer, we have a TAS only bit clip method to do 260 note door skip like this. We have a similar setup for 180 skip, conveniently using this gruntling to cause some lag. Again, TAS only. And also a 50 note door skip, using that beehive to cause a bit of lag. Again, this one's still TAS only, which is why I've done it in red there. So the answer to the question is we can skip every single note door, and in fact the any % TAS can be done with 0 notes, although it does grab a couple of notes that just happen to be in the way. And that's pretty much reliant on these bit clips here that go through flat ground, flutter underneath, and ground pound back up through. But it turns out that bit clipping like that is actually a PAL only technique, so it only works on the versions of the game that were released in Europe and Australia and places like that. If we're playing the NTSC version instead, you need to have some height off of a higher up ledge to jump through the floor like this. So now we're going to compare to the NTSC version of the game. PAL is the fastest version because you can have 0 notes to beat it, but the question on NTSC gets a bit messier and some of the skips we use are really cool. So the first question you might have is, can we do a 10 note door skip on NTSC? Because otherwise there's sort of no point to doing this at all. The answer is most likely yes. The reason big clips don't work on NTSC to get past walls is because you just don't have the right spacing on your jump height. But right next to the 810 door is this cauldron, and you can pretty much walk up and down this to get any height that you want, and the bit clip spot is right next to the cauldron there. So I'm going to go with yes, this is possible, although it would most likely be TAS only again on NTSC, unless we have some really good setup we could find for it. Now the 350, 450 and 640 skips work exactly the same on NTSC, so we know those are possible and possible RTA. 765 skip will be possible, but I'll keep it in red since we do need to use one of those B methods. Unfortunately, the method where we go through this little gap in the floor doesn't work for the same reason bit clips don't really work to get past walls on NTSC, unless we have a higher ledge to jump from, which isn't the case here. That leaves us at 260 notes with no seemingly obvious way to get past this note door, but let's see what we can do and see if we can skip any of these 3 remaining note doors. Now it turns out the answer is yes, we can skip some of these note doors. First one we'll look at is the 50 note door skip, and it uses a Jiggy despawn method very similar to what happened to King KC with the 765 note door. We die holding a Jiggy in Mumbo's Mountain and then turn into the termite, grab the Jiggy on top, and if everything lines up right we'll despawn that 50 note door. I have still ticked that one off in red though because it's got a bit of a lengthy setup to it involving getting the termite and everything. Now it turns out you can do a very similar thing with the 260 note door. So this is the statue room, and if you turn into the washing machine by doing the bottles bonus mini games, you don't get a Jiggy grab animation. That's really important for the despawn glitch. Using Jiggy despawn, you can despawn this 260 note door right here and go on through. So we'll tick this one off too, but again in red because this setup would probably take 8 or 9 minutes to do in full. Now that just leaves us with the 180 note door. There's no really good ground to work off, there's no G's in this room that we could use to despawn the note door, and while we might be able to bit clip down here, bit clipping on ledges actually is quite tricky. I have actually heard rumours of somebody running up against this seam here and clipping through the 180 note door, but after a lot of testing we couldn't replicate it. So that's pretty much where NTSC stands. I don't see any realistic way to skip this one, so it'd be 180 notes on NTSC. The only potential way to skip the 180 note door on NTSC that I can see at least would be to use the sandcastle cheats. There's cheats to open every single note door except for the 810 note door, which is really frustrating. The game will only let you enter up to 3 cheats, so realistically you probably use those 3 cheats on 180, 260 and maybe 765 in something like a any percent with cheats TAS. Alrighty, now let's go over what we've learned. So in RTA, the limit is pretty much 810 notes for now on PAL and NTSC. We don't really see much way around that unless we find a proper setup that works. On Xbox, it's still the same. For TAS, it's a little bit different. PAL is 0 notes and NTSC is 180 as we've talked about. Xbox is a little bit unknown because we can't really TAS Xbox. I suspect it might be 0 notes if we can get a lag frame for the bit clip to work. TAS with sandcastle code 00 and again question mark, we're not entirely sure. So in terms of what version's the fastest now, Xbox is actually the fastest for RTA, and that's mainly because we can start in Rusty Bucket Bay and also there's a glitch to duplicate notes. But in terms of TAS, PAL is probably faster for now unless we can get an 810 skip on Xbox and if we could actually TAS Xbox. In terms of sandcastle codes, PAL is still probably the fastest, just because we wouldn't actually use any sandcastle codes. They are very slow to enter. So I hope you found this video informative and useful. Just one little note before we finish up. I never realized this as a kid, but the note icon is actually 2 notes. Kind of weird decision on that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.